So we're here now on Peidalid Amid Beis, and we're trying to understand the Mishnah of Kohen Hedjot Shenasa Almana, and he has a brother who's a Kohen Gadol. So that's Muteres Labal Asur Liyavam. And we were raising the question, why does it mention, the Mishnah says Nasa Almana? Why not just say Nasa Besula? Because it wouldn't change anything at all, the fact that she's an Almana. She became an Almana the very moment that her Kohen Hedjot, the older brother of the Kohen Gadol, passed away. Says the Gemara, if you'll answer that Kosav Tana Nesuna Rishonim Apilin, the Tana of Mishnah is of the opinion that Nisuin Harishonim Mapilin. That means the Zika of the Yibum is created, is generated when the late husband got married. Not when he dies, but from the time of his marriage, of his Nisuin. And what happens is that at the time of his marriage, if it was only Kedushin, then there would be a Zikas Yibum to his brother who's a Kohen Gadol, because she's still a Besula, and she's not an Almana. Now, once there's a Chalos Zikas Yibum, even though B'Shas Nefila, she's already an Almana, and therefore she's Asura to his brother Kohen Gadol. But nevertheless, if Nesuin Rishonim Apilin, then the Zikas Yibum is Chal even before the Isser Almana is Chal, and there would be a Chiyav Yibum. So why is Asura Lezeh? It has to be an Almana who had a previous marriage before she married this one. It can't be a Basula. Because if she wasn't an Almana from a previous marriage, then when she had Kedushin to this Kohen Hedjot, the Kohen Gadol would have been Chayav to be Miyabim her after she becomes an Almana, because the Zikas Yibum emerged before the Isser Almana. And that's called the Sunnah Rishonim Ma'pilim. So the Gemara rejects this. Why? Hare, the Tana mentions amongst the list of cases of Muteres L'Baleim, the Asuris L'Yevamot, Chalal Shenasa Kshera. Now let's see if we apply the principle of Nisuin Rishonim Apilin to this particular scenario of a Chalal Shenasa Kshera. How can you tell me it's Asuris L'Yevmeim? Because a Zikas Yibum to the surviving brother, the Yavam, the Kohen Kasher, would have emerged with the marriage itself, because she's a Kshera. It's only later on, when they consummate the marriage between a Chalal and a Kshera, only then does the Zikas Yibum sour, so to speak. It becomes Asur, because now she's a Chalola. But in the original marriage situation, she was not a Chalola, she was a Kshera. So you see clearly that our Mishnah is not operating with the premise of Nisuin or Rishonim Apilin. So the Gemara has to answer the ID answer. Havadai Mishum Seifa. The reason the Tana mentions Almana and Apesula is only because of the Seifa. In the Seifa, he tells me, Kohen Gadol Shenoses Almana V'Yeshlo Ach Kohen Gadol Kohen Hedjot. And this is the case of Asuris L'Baleim Uliv Man. Both are Asurim, and that's going to be Dafka Almana, only because the Kohen Gadol married Almana who was married in a previous relationship. And that's why the Kohen Gadol had violated Isra. Basula, if she was a Basula, then there would be no Isra in the Kohen Gadol marrying her. It's Chazi, like she's Ru'ilo. And this would not fit into the category which is now being described as Asuris L'Baleim Mutaris, Asuris L'Baleim Uli Yevmehem. Usmishum Hachi Ktari Almana. That's why the Reisha mentions Almana Agav the Seifa. Now, in the case of a Mitri or a Mitris who are enjoined from entering the Kal until Dar Shlishi, so it's got to be the grandson of the Mitri. So the grandfather was Miskayer, And the grandson is a Yisrael Kasha. He's the third generation mitzvah, and he's allowed to come into the call. So now the Gemara wants to clarify, why didn't the Mishnah add a whole bunch of possible cases of Iser v'hetel b'alem u'liyadmean? And what would be common to the question that the Gemara is going to ask, the categories and scenarios the Gemara is going to present now, is they're all what we call chayvei essay. Maskifla Rav Papa Isa Laha Techi Asir Rav Dibi Omer Rav Yochanan Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Mitzvah Rishona B'na Sheni Havi. Rav Yochanan's opinion is that the mother will determine the status of the child. So he, the father in this case, was a Mitzri Sheni, and his son should be a Mitzri Shlishi, who's Mutar B'Kol, but he married a Mitzvah Rishona, which he's allowed to do. But B'na, the son, to his dismay, is not a Shlishi, but rather a Sheni, because the Vlad Holech Achar Apostle, and back on Daf Ayin Ches, we had a drush of Asher Yivoldu and Akosiv Toloi Beleda. And as far as the Leda is concerned, he's a Mitzri Sheni. So now, in the light of Rabbi Yochanan, listening Nami, why didn't the Mishnah give additional examples of Chayvei Essay? And what would that mean? A Mitzri Sheni Shenasa Shtei Mitzrios. A Mitzri Sheni married two Mitzrios Achas Rishona. And the child from that marriage will be a Sheni. Achas Shnia. And if a Mitzri Sheni is married to a Mitzri Shnia, the child is a Mitzri Shlichi's Mutar B'Kol. V'hayil abanim mirishona. He had children from the Mitzris Rishona. Correct? Because Achas Mehen Rishona. So according to the statement of Rabbi Yochanan that we just had, the children, in the case of a Mitzvah Rishona, go bust of the mother, and therefore they have a din of Psulei Kol, din Mitzvah Sheni. Now, if he has children from his other wife, who's a Shnia, those children are Mitzvah Shlishi, and they're Yisrael and Shem, they're Mutar B'Kol. And he adds here a note, V'gam heim asurim kechol ish Yisrael lisa mitzri adar shlishi. Now these two sons are brothers from the same father. Inasuv kiur chayu. Okay, kiur chayu means we're matching it up with equals. So if two brothers from the same father both marry nashim mutaros lehem, we want to get mutaros lehem, aleim v'asuros lehem. So one of them married a Mitzri Sheni. Just 1 second. So he's a Mitzri Sheni, and he married a Mitzri Sheni. The other one is a Mitzri Shlishi, and just 1 second. Shtei Nashim. This is Shona Mitzvah Shnia. So again, the Mitzri Sheni married a Mitzvah Shnia. The Mitzri Shlishi married the other woman who was a Mitzvah Rishona. No. I'm sorry. Just 1 second. Just get it. Right, a Mitzri Shlishi married a Yisraelis. Okay? And now let's say the brother was a Mitzri Sheni, dies. He was married to a Mitzri Shnia, and now the Mitzri Shnia falls for Yibum to a Mitzri Shlishi, and a Mitzri Shlishi is not allowed to marry a Mitzri Shnia. So again, even though the marriages were both legitimate, because a Mitzri Sheni is allowed to marry a Mitzri Sheni, and a Mitzri Shlishi is allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael Kshera, but nevertheless, Asurus Liyibmeya. Right? Because the one who's married to Mitzri Shnia, I should say, he died, and she's Asur B'Kol. Now she falls for Yibum to a Mitzri Shlishi who's also, he's not allowed to marry a Mitzri Sheni. So here we have another case of Muteres L'Baleim v'Asur L'Yibmeim. Now the Gemara says v'epoch v'nasuv. Now instead of matching them up equal, let's switch it around. Each one of the brothers married a woman that's Asura Olav by flipping it around. In other words, now the Mitzri Sheni marries the Israelis, which he's not allowed to do. The Mitzri Shlishi, who's the Yisrael Kosher, marries a Mitzri Shnia, which he's not allowed to do. And yet, Mutaras Liyibmeim. Why? Because the brother, who's a Mitzri Sheni, and he died, his wife is Muteres to the Yavam. Just 1 second. And so again, the Mitzri Sheni married, let me just go over this one more time. He married a Yisraelis, and his brother is a Mitzri Shlishi, so he's allowed to marry Yisraelis. So it's Asura L'Baleim and Muteres L'Yibmeim. Asurus L'Baleim. And so too, when we get to Muteres L'Elu Ve'elu, we could add the case of Gioros. So you have two brothers, a Mitzri Sheni and a Mitzri Shlishi, and they both married Gioros, and that's Muteres L'Naseh, because a Mitzri is allowed to marry Giores, because we're holding out Kal Gerim Lo Mikri Kol, and therefore, whichever one of these two brothers dies, there's going to be a Heter Yibum to his wife who's a Giores. So whether or not the Mitzri Sheni died and left a wife who's a Giores, or the Mitzri Shlishi died and left a wife who's a Giores, there's a Heter Yibum. Because a Mitzri is allowed to marry Giores. Asurus L'Elu L'Elu Eilanios. Let's say a Mitzri Sheni marries an Eilanis, which is a violation of an Isur of Bias Kol, and he dies, and now his wife is an Eilanis, and she falls for Yibum to his brother. Well, there's no Yibum by an Eilanis. She's not Ruya Laholit. And if we go back to the Isur Erev of Eshesah, and the Gemara answers Tana Vashir. That Tana doesn't cover all the possible scenarios. So the Gemara asks, "My shir dahai shir." Where do you see that the Mishnah clearly omits cases? It doesn't make sense that the Tana would decide that these are the cases we're going to mention and these not. And we're all trying. This is the whole effort here is to try to defend Rabbi Yochanan who hold the mitzvah sheni shenasa mitzvah rishona is bina sheni havi. So Gemara says, I'll prove to you, Shir P'tua Daka, who's also level of call, so he has a diagram. Now we're going to work out P'tua Daka in 4 different possible scenarios to cover all the 4 variables in our Mishnah and prove the ton of the Shir. So the first is a P'tua Daka who marries a Bas Yisrael Asurulo. He has an Ach Kosher who's not a P'tua Daka, and he's Mutar B'Bas Yisrael. So that's Mutaros, and that's Asura Lebaleim and Mutaros Liadmeim. Because the Yavam is allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael. Then we'll have a case of a kosher who's not a P'tua Daka, and he marries a Bas Yisrael, so that's mutter. But he has a brother who's P'tua Daka, so that's muteres lebalem vasuros liadmeim. Then we have a case of a P'tua Daka who marries a Bas Yisrael be'isur. He has a brother who's also P'tua Daka. He's not allowed to marry a Bas Yisrael, so it's asur lezel lezel. Then we have a case of P'tua Daka who marries a Giores, and that's mutter. Kalgerim loik recall. And he has a brother who's a P'tua Daka. And when his wife, who's a Giores, falls for Yibum to the P'tua Daka, that's mutter. Or ach kosher shemutter af b'Giores. So that's going to be mutter b'zeh. So we have all 4 scenarios here in the case of P'tua Daka. So Gemara rejects this. Imishum P'tua Daka lav chiura ta'tonile chayve lav. In other words, our question on Rabbi Yochanan was from Mitzri, which is chayve esa. Why were those left out? And you're asking me from P'tua Daka, I'll tell you why those were left out. We already covered the gamut of lavim, isurei lavim. And there's no need to mention P'tua Daka because he also fits into Chayve Lav. So the Gemara says, Otu Chayve Lav Milo Katani V'Hadar Tani. We find in the Mishnah that the Mishnah is going to elaborate on all different scenarios of Chayve Lav. Haktani Kohen Hedget Shenos Almono, which is Chayve Lavim. Cholol Shenos Kshera, which is Chayve Lavim, because as a result of the Bia, she becomes a Cholol who falls to the Yibum, to her brother, to the brother-in-law who's a kosher, Kohen kosher. So we see that the Mishnah is going to go into detail about many different scenarios of Chayve Lavim, and therefore why doesn't it mention P'tua Daka? We must come to the conclusion that Tana V'Shir, and that would be a defense for Rabbi Yochanan. So Gemara rejects this. Ahu, that which the Tana adds to Chayve Lavim Chol Shenosek Shera, V'yesh Loach Kosher, that's not because the Tana wanted to cover all possible scenarios, but the Itzrach, but rather there's a special chiddush here in that particular scenario. Lashmini ki Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Yom Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Lo Huzaru Ksheros Linase Lepsuit. That a Kohenes Shera is allowed to marry a apostle, meaning only he, the Kohen Kosher, is not allowed to marry a Chalola, but the other way around, a Kohenes Shera is allowed to marry a Chalol. So a Kohen Kosher is not allowed to marry a Chalol, but a Kohenes Kshera is allowed to marry a Chalol. So when the Mishnah teaches us about a Chalol Shenosek Kshera, it means a Kohenes Kshera. And the Tana is being mechadish to me that she's allowed to have this marriage with her husband, who's a Chalol, even though she's a Kohenes. So wait a minute, you're telling me that each case in the Mishnah has a chiddush. Vaktani chol shenasak shera, v'yesho ach kosher, and that's a case of muteris lebaila, v'asura liyavam, because the yavam is a kohen kosher, and now she, the Yevamot, is a chalola. And here's another case which the Mishnah added of Chayvei Lam. Yisrael shenasa bas Yisrael, v'yeshlo ach mamzer. And this is a case of muteres lebal v'asur liyavam. So we see that the Tana has many, many different examples of Chayvei Lam. And therefore the question arises, what happened to Petzua Daka? And the answer is Tana V'Shir, he left it out. So Gemara rejects it. Hanami lo meheder misni. These are not superfluous cases mentioned in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is being mechadish something in each particular scenario. Ashme'inon, the Tana wants to teach me an Isser in a lav she'ein shava bakol. Like the Isser of Cholol, who married a Kshera, and because of the intimacy between the husband and his wife, she becomes a chalola, and she's asura liyabem hakohen, because the Iser chalolos applies only to Kohanim and not to Yisraelim. Just 1 second. It's a lav she'eno shav bakol, because chalolos only applies to Kohanim. Kamash malon lav shav bakol. So in addition to teaching me lav she'eno shav bakol, the Mishnah wants to mention lav hashav bakol, which is the case of mamzer, who is prohibited to both Kohanim and Yisrael. And the Tana is being mechadesh that even a woman who's asur al baila b'isur lav hashav bakol, she's muteres liyav. So once again, there's no raya from our Mishnah that Tana V'Shir. Why? Because all the cases listed in the Mishnah, each one individually has its own chiddush. But in the case of Petzua Daka, it doesn't have a chiddush. It's just another example of a chiyuv lav, and therefore it was left out of the Mishnah, but that's not Tana V'Shir. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, I still have another X number of cases of Chayvei Lavim. Or Ketani, we have in the Mishnah, Yisrael Shenasa Mamzeres, Yeshloach Yisrael, and Mamzer Shenasa Mamzeres, Yeshloach Yisrael. And in these two cases, we're talking about a Lav HaShav Bakol. And the Tana repeats himself, gives more examples of Chayvei Lavim. And this brings us to the final conclusion of the sugya, L'lav shmamina Tana V'Shir. So these cases of mamzeres, whether it's a mamzer shenasa mamzeres, whether it's Yisrael shenasa mamzeres, in all these cases it's a lav hashav bakol, and therefore there's no extra chidush here, and therefore the Mishnah apparently is covering all its bases, every single scenario of Chayvei Lavim, and the question is why Petzua Daka was omitted. And therefore, we must conclude Shmamina that Tana V'Shir, which is good news for Rabbi Yochanan. Ufam Rabbi Yehuda Marav lo huzur ksheros linosi l'psul. If you have a kohenes kshera, she's allowed to marry a cholol. And even though as a result of this marriage, she becomes a chalola. And not only that, her children are chalola, but nevertheless, the marriage is legitimate. Le Misayela, should we bring our Mishnah as a raya of Yehuda Marav? It says in our Mishnah Kohen, cholol, shenasa kshera. And he has a brother who's a kosher, he's not a cholol. That's considered mutaris l'balei and vasurus liyadmei. My love, Kohenes haru'uyala. So the pashtus here in that Mishnah is that the Cholol married a Kohenes. I don't know why that's the pashtus in the Mishnah, but in any event, the Mishnah is trying to tell me that's a case of Muteres L'Baal Le'em, because she is a Kohenes Ksher. She's allowed to marry a Cholol, like Rav Yehuda Marav. Like Ksher, Ksher L'Kahuna. Lo, Gemara says, well, who told you that Ksher means Ksher L'Kahuna? Yisraelis, Mike Ksher, Ksher L'Kol. So the Gemara asks, if when the Mishnah says Chol Shenasa Kshera, Yesh Lo Ach Kosher, and are we going to say that Nami here also the word kosher means kosher l'kol, Michlal dehu, it means the late husband who is a cholol, pasal l'kol. Now that's not true. A chol is kosher l'kol. Elalav, Kohen, we must be referring to a Kohen kosher l'kuna. And therefore we have two words that are written together in one breath. They should be analogous, they should be equal. Neither who Kohen, right, the kosher is a Kohen kosher, is he, she also is a Kohen, is kshera. She's a Bas Kohen. So one rejects this. Midi ira hakadisa hadisa. You don't have to equate the two words just because they're brought in the same breath. And kosher and ksher could mean two different things. A kosher means it's a kohen kosher, and a ksher means she's ksher l'kol, but it doesn't mean she's a kohenes. So you cannot establish a proof here for Rav based on that Mishnah. And now the Gemara raised an objection to Rav. Masiv. Ravin bar Nachman on Rav. We have a brisa that's darshaning the pasuk Isha zona v'chalolo yikachu, Isha grucha Isha lo yikachu, and the pasuk repeats itself unnecessarily. Lo yikachu twice. It says lo yikachu. Malamed shah Isha mutzeres al yidei ish. That even a kohenes is enjoined from marrying a chol, and that's against Rav. Rava says, no, that's not what the Bryce has in mind, that a Kohenes Kshera is not allowed to marry a Chol. But rather, the Bryce is coming to teach me that Kol Hecha Dehu Muzar, he Muteres. Whenever the Kohen is enjoined for marrying her, like for example, a Kohen Kosher is enjoined for marrying a Zono Chalola, is lo yikachu means that she too is muteres. She's not allowed to marry him. Again, that doesn't mean that she can't marry a cholol, because a cholol is allowed to marry a kshera. But if the kohen is not enjoined for marrying her, for example, a kohen cholol is allowed to marry an isha kshera, then she's allowed to marry him. The chol is not violating any Isur with that marriage, then the Kohenes who's marrying him is not violating any Isur as well. So are you deriving that Ish Isha are Shavim, and that since he's allowed to marry her, she's allowed to marry him, and if he's not allowed to marry her, she's not allowed to marry him? You're deriving this from the parsha of Kahuna. That's a universal halacha. It has nothing to do with lo yikachu. Don't quote the pasuk lo yikachu. Rav Yehuda Marav nafka di Rav Yehuda Marav eitan Rav Yehuda Mitchell ish o ish k'yasa mikol chatas od lil mal b'Hashem yoshma hanefshahi. And it says in the pasuk ish o isha hishva kosav ish o leish lechalon shim shabbat Torah. The women are included in all lavim in the Torah. And that's a universal halacha. You don't need a pasuk lo yikachu to tell me that a isha musheres al yidei ish. Just apply the general principle of hishva kasu isha leish. The Gemara answers, I mihahi If I only had this general universal halach that's derived from Isha or Isha, Hava, I would have thought Lav, Hashav, Bakol, those, that principle only applies in a Lav that applies to Kol Yisrael, and not just limited to Kohen. And in all those Lavim that Hashav, Bakol, the Torah equates a man and a woman. Avo, Lav, Shein, Hashav, Bakol, like the Isur Zona Chalot to Kohen, doesn't apply to Yisrael, obviously, is low. The Torah did not equate them. Lo hishva ben akasuv, each ala each. And therefore, I might think that in Isha Zona v'chalola, although the Kohen is not allowed to marry her, but she's not violating any Isur if she marries him. And therefore, the Torah had to tell me the word lo yikachu, that Isha musheres kamo ish. And that applies even in Isur lav she'eno shav b'kol, like Zona v'chalola lekohen. And here on the top of Daf Pei Hey, the Gemara is going to ask on this distinction between a lav shav b'kol, lav she'eno shav b'kol. I'm going to prove to you that even in a lav she'eno shav b'kol, like Tumas Kohanim, where a Kohen is enjoined from being metami lemes, which is clearly a lav she'eno shav b'kol, we have a havamina to say that B'nos Aaron, a Kohenes, is allowed to enter into a funeral, into a cemetery. But time of the cause of Rahman, but because we have a pasuk in Parshas Emor, it says Emor al Kohenim b'nei Aaron. And we darshan that b'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. So if not for this miyut, we would have assumed that the b'nos Aaron are enjoined from going into a cemetery, just like the b'nei Aaron. Olav hachi noshim chayavos. My timer, la bishum Rabbi Yehuda Marav. It must be because Rabbi Yehuda Marav, who says a hishva kasu, isha leish lechalon shishbet Torah. We're applying it now to Isha Tumas Kohanim, which is a lav she'eno shav b'kol. So how can you tell me that there's a distinction between lav hashav b'kol, lav she'eno shav b'kol with regard to Isha? That's not true. We see that fundamentally, if not for a special drasha, and especially Afusa, the Bas Kohen would have been enjoined from going into a cemetery to mitami l'meisen. We have a special mute of b'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron. Otherwise, we would have equated it, even though we're talking about a lav she'eno shav b'kol. So the Gemara rejects it. With this, we'll conclude for today. Lo. The reason why we need a special limud alfusa that a kohenis is allowed to be mitame, and that's derived from b'nei Aaron v'lo b'nos Aaron, that's not because of each v'isha, and a woman is equal to a man even in a lav she'eno shekol, but rather gamrina milo yikachu. We would have had a havamina to derive from lo yikachu that she is asura because of the plural use of lo yikachu. And the brisa derived from lo yikachu, if you recall, that a chalala is enjoined from marrying a Kohen kosher. So that even in Isurei Kahuna, which is a lav she'eno shav b'kol, we would equate a woman with a man, and therefore we would have done so with regard to Tumas Kohanim as well, and she cannot go into the cemetery. Therefore, I need the pasuk of b'nei Aaron, v'lo b'nos Aaron as a special miyut.